what does this Pact of Forgetting look like? It looks like not having a direct confrontation about the legacy of the previous dictatorship. We do not prosecute members of that dictatorship. We don't spend any money on that. We do not confront the legacy. So no holidays, no road names, no cultural celebrations of overthrowing this particular dictator, i.e. Spain in the post-Franco regime is part of the input slide. And for a reasonable debate, you can assume that it is possible to have this. There's incentive on both sides for it to happen, things like mutual resource sharing between both parties. So for a reasonable debate, let's just assume that it can occur. What does opposition then have to defend? It looks like the Philippines, where they celebrated the fall of the Marcos dictatorship previously, with the Cory Aquino term that came after celebrating the People EDSA revolution, for example. It looks like Cambodia, where Hun Sen came into power, members with the way the state operates and the resources they use to keep the state functioning. They have things like infrastructure to their advantage because they have previous trust of the people running these important government assets. And they use it to do things like rebuild infrastructure, rebuild healthcare, rebuild schools, incredibly important for developing societies. But the second benefit that we get from opening government is that you just avoid conflict inherently. You take away incentives for more smaller uprisings to come back. You take things away like what's happening in Myanmar with the military junta. So you give both parties certainty of what the future looks like. Things like discussing cabinet appointments together and agreeing what comes next, agreeing how you'll move forward in existing infrastructure, as opposed to the incentive on their side actually go against the previous dictatorship. So your hook here is very simple. On our side of the house, we focus more on the benefits of the governments working together and then using that as a precondition for rebuilding. Rebuilding might not be incredibly fast, it might not be the most democratic, but at the very least we guarantee basic systems functioning for the most vulnerable individuals. And for those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And I'd like to welcome the leader of the opposition.
When a Pact of Forgetting occurs, dictators are empowered to rewrite history. It allows them to preserve their legacy in a way that is incredibly pernicious to people on the ground. It does suffering to the people who have experienced a huge amount of trauma. And obviously, it doesn't have to be as extreme as closing government says in a genocide. It can be just something far simpler than that, but that is still something that is morally abhorrent to oppose. Firstly, 4 pieces of setup. Second of all, a claim on justice. First piece of characterization is that often at the end of these conflicts, parties are coming together in a way that is unclear who the victor is. Think about places like South Africa after apartheid. Think about places like Bosnia after a civil war. Think about places like South Korea. Second of all, what do we support? We support the embracing of that conflict. We support the confrontation of that truth. That is having policy that helps people. It is promoting reconciliation. Thirdly, it looks like things like truth and reconciliation commissions know the fact that their side does just have to forgo truth and reconciliation because in the short term it is at odds with that policy of Pact of Forgetting. You don't have the political will to be able to do it. So even if they get TRCs in the long term, they certainly don't in the short. What do the TRCs look like? One, it looks like amnesty in exchange for testimony, which is an incredibly attractive offer to a lot of dictators. Two, it looks like fact-finding and actively looking into what happened. No. Thirdly, it looks like recommending policy that actively helps the victims that are most oppressed on the ground. What is the case for opening opposition? It is that we can only get stability in post-conflict states at the point where you have justice and at the point that you have truth. That is the most important contribution at this round. The first thing I want to note in this argument is that these states are often on the brink of more conflict, in that there is deep ethnic tension in this place, in that atrocities have gone unaccounted for, there is a huge amount of lost human dignity, and that should make people believe that these states are in a place of precedent of going good or going bad. Why do we think that this policy directly prevents justice? Firstly, it does just cause an increase in violence. People feel as if the state has failed them. There is a huge amount of ethnic tension and ethnic hatred, and that manifests in a way that is terrible. Second of all, it means that people are less likely to trust institutions. No, because the problem is that people perceive these institutions that exist now as complicit. The only chance institutions have to redeem themselves is right now. The way here is that you cannot do this later. You must do it now because you must get the trust of constituents in the ground in the short term if you're ever going to get anything in the long term. Thirdly, these injustices are essential to human dignity. Know the fact, things like forcing people to disappear, things like detaining individuals with no explanation, things like mass rapes must be accounted for, and the only way you are ever able to do that is through deregulation our states. No. Second of all, why do we think forgetting and signing the Pact of Forgetting directly goes against justice? First of all, people do not forget. You can tell people to forget, but that does not mean that they do forget, and the problem with that is that their memory is of what has just happened and they need somewhere to express that. Second of all, for all the time opening government wants to talk about socio-economic justice, that fails to provide them with redress that they are actually asking for on the ground for the type of injustice that they have suffered, because their trust in these institutions is gone. So, even if you're able to give them out some form of money, that means nothing to them. Justice goes hand in hand with economic reparations, but I'm going to prove to you later where reparations are a million fucking times easier on our side. Thirdly, why do we think TRCs are just injustice. Firstly, telling the truth is in itself reconciliation. The first thing I want to note here is that this is a thing that is seen as bipartisan. Note this is directly responsive to opening government. Because in almost all post-conflict states, both parties have committed war crimes. Obviously to a different extent, but there is still damage that is being done on both sides. When it is exposed, people believe you are holding both sides to account, which does make it directly bipartisan. But also, often most people on the ground have just suffered in some way, and that should make you believe that most people are on board with these efforts of TRCs. Second of all, even those at the absolute top have an incentive to participate, because those are the individuals that are able to do things like get amnesty, which means that you're able to provide them a huge amount of economic benefit. But individuals who themselves experience the suffering are likely to participate, because for them it's just really cathartic, it's validating, it makes them feel like their experiences are being heard, it means that they're more likely to get reparations when those TRCs are successful, and that is incredibly useful. The third thing to note though is that often these TRCs are incredibly widely spread. We know, for example, after apartheid South Africa having radio talks that literally platform the stories of the individuals that have undergone suffering. That was something that was incredibly useful to people. It was, for example, perpetrators of terrible crimes explaining what they'd signed off on and explaining the horrors that they'd committed. Note that the media has a massive incentive to platform this by virtue of the fact that the stuff is massively visceral, massively clickbaity, everyone has an incentive to buy into it. Next, why do we think truth is incredibly valedictory and useful? This is also directly responsive to opening government. First of all, there is some form of realization that everyone is at fault. Because, obviously some people at the top will not agree, but most people on the ground realise that fault has happened on both sides, and there is a direct fear of reprisal. So even moderates are likely to be complicit in this process because they realise their own leaders have done something wrong. Second of all though, it allows for a level of empathy that is just impossible when you forget. Because panel, at the point when you forget and you're not allowed to actively criticise previous leaders or what has happened, it just means that people feel that they are under a sensitive level of control that delegitimises all of their experiences, their family members being killed and shot in the street, and that is something that makes them feel terrible. Finally, why do you think this better leads to other forms of reconciliation? The first thing to note is that it is able to get apologies and trust rebuilding. But second of all, co-opting everything we hear from OG, you're better able to get reparations. No. This looks like things like finance, for example, to rebuild homes that have been destroyed. It looks like, for example, getting graves to people to give them the respect they deserve in death. It looks like memorials that people can go and use educational institutions and teach future generations and share that oral and written history in a way that's incredibly productive. But also, it looks like giving them medical and psychological relief in a way that's incredibly useful. That gives people a massive sense of solace. Note the fact this is exclusive to our side, because what the fuck was the point? One, political will is just far better on our side because you have the incentive to do it. But second of all, when you don't do it now, it means that you lose the ability for people to have, for example, family member stories. You lose people because they die out. You must do it now. You cannot do it later when you don't have that evidence. What is the blame at the end of the round? First of all, justice is the thing that causes stability. If both sides of this round care about stability, we are the ones that bring it to you because we really build that trust in institutions. That is just essential. Second of all, people feel validated in their experiences of trauma, and you must do that sooner rather than later. But thirdly, you lose all of the evidence to be able to successfully do TRCs at the point when you don't do it in status quo. Panel, the most important thing is the massive amount of victims feeling there is some sense of recourse and solace for the suffering that they have undergone for family members that have died. Even if it's not genocide, it can be something far, far less bad than that. That is still something that is deeply regrettable for an opening competition.
Thank you very much for the speech. And I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
The first question I want to ask is, what happens when you remember and what happens when you talk about previous dictatorships? Because this team requires you to believe a very specific train of logic, which is that everyone will believe that we did something wrong and they will all give reparations to minorities. We told you that the newly formed government criticizes the old government. Many newly formed governments establish power through military coups or through popular anti-government uprisings. The criticism outcomes are bad for post-conflict societies for the simple reason that they only provide, which is still not responded to, which is that dictators are popular. I state leader. These dictators had cults of personality because they led the country through independence or the period of decolonization. These dictators often also improved the economic conditions and provided immense amounts of social welfare to individuals to justify their authority and to justify their single-party rule. So it's not the case that it's so cut and dry that everybody hated the dictator. Oftentimes there are large groups of people, large ethnicities and large people that believe certain ideologies that are actually in huge favor of the dictator. This means that criticizing the previous dictator makes the new government seem illegitimate as it's not acknowledging a key part of the country's history. You are attacking someone they view as the father of independence or someone who led the country through periods of war, and this is what precipitates political instability. But the second outcome that we told you is that this weakens democratic institutions. The new government is going to weaponize the trauma of the dictator's reign in order to justify things like rigging elections, stacking the Supreme Court, rewriting the Constitution, and shutting down opposition. People are scared of atrocities happening again and just vote in this new government in order to centralize more power in them to avoid atrocities happening again. When this new government is allowed to use fear-mongering and the boogeyman of the dictator, they say, look at all of these terrible things that happened in the past, we must avoid it, allow us to stack the Supreme Court and rewrite the Constitution. That is what weakens democratic structure. But the last argument here is that this is just terrible for policy making. Not only for the reasons that Naomi already provides you, which is that post-conflict societies have very little manpower because lots of people died during the conflict or because elites fled to other countries during the conflict, but also the majority of the policies end up just being anti-dictator. Things like if the dictator was socialist, your entire party line end up becoming anti-socialist because you're unable to push for socialist policies if your entire platform is based on criticizing the previous dictator who was socialist and led to all those harms. This is what's likely to happen in the immediate aftermath of this new government taking power. Even if they criticize the dictator, it doesn't lead to reparations happening, it leads to a huge amount of political stability. But let's think about this in another scenario. What happens a few years later when the new government is perhaps a little bit unstable or when the new government is perhaps failing in some areas? It looks like the Philippines, where the people call the Marcos regime the golden age of the Philippines. You end up getting parties that celebrate the dictatorship. So it's not always the case that this party will criticize the dictator for the genocide. What often happens is a few years down the road, when the collective memory of society begins to weaken and fade, you end up having people rewriting history. So when their side says rewriting of history happens, it's not on our side of the house. If the people are allowed to talk about history, when they're allowed to deny the facts, when they're allowed to say the genocide didn't happen, when they're allowed to say that this policy actually improved the economic condition, that's when rewriting happens. And they're giving the ability of people to rewrite to major political parties that control state media and have the ability to influence the mind of people through things like history textbooks. There are many harms to this. The first is that this is deeply offensive, that minorities have been, like minority communities have been oppressed and killed by the dictator, deeply traumatizing that a political party is now celebrating them. But the second is that you end up justifying dictatorial behavior. You are praising a person who killed political opponents and rigged elections. This makes individuals more accepting of anti-democratic behavior because they are glorifying things like Marcos rewriting the constitution or glorifying things like Marcos shutting down opposition. So they have to prove to us that it will always be the case that criticism happens in a way of criticizing the dictators. There are so many stories around the world, so many post-conflict states where the narratives that major parties are perpetuating, it's not one of criticizing the dictator, but one of praising and rewriting the history of the dictator, saying that the dictator gave us so much economic benefits and so much prosperity. Regardless of whether the new government condemns or praises the previous regimes, it will always anger one group. Because post-conflict societies are ideologically and ethnically diverse, there is no one narrative that a major political party can have that will appease all factions and all groups in society. Therefore, what is likely to happen is that some parties will praise and some parties will condemn. And that leads to political polarization. Because people primarily vote on whether you are supporting the dictator or whether you are against the dictator, which reduces all of politics to identity politics. When the main platform that the major parties have is whether they support Marcos or whether they are against Marcos. There's less focus on transparency, there's less focus on economic policy and things like social welfare. When the main thing that you see on media is whether someone is praising the legacy of the dictator or whether someone is criticizing the legacy of the dictator. And also, the harms of Naomi, which is that it's very hard for these parties to cooperate and find bipartisanship when they fundamentally disagree on a key part of history. When one party says Marcos did this and another party says Marcos did not do this, this means that they're fundamentally unable to cooperate. But the second impact is that this fractures people. They cannot view themselves as part of the same nation and imagined community because a group of people are praising someone who killed your family or a group of people are condemning someone who believed the uplifted you from poverty. This is what emboldens separatist groups. This is what emboldens more multi-party politics that leads to political gridlock where so many people cannot agree on one fundamental thing. Before I move on closing this,
suppose that, like 1990, anarchists in the Philippines doing research on the crimes of the Marcos dictatorship, should we send him to prison so his book doesn't divide the people?
No, we shouldn't send him to prison. We just shouldn't allow him to do that. We don't really do the fact-finding there because all the people in the country already knew what happened. Why do we need Western other people outside the country to know all the terrible things that Marcos did? The conclusion at this point in my speech is that talking about it is never productive and it always perpetuates instability. The claim of opposition is that the truth is important. First response, minorities know what happened and live through their experience, and they know the stories that are passed down through generations. Denial happens when you let people talk about it and a major political party says this never happened or it was not as bad as you claim. It's unlikely that reparation will happen in a world where there's major political pushback from a political party that supports a dictator saying that we can't give reparations to this group because they are lying about what happened in the genocide. Everyone being quiet about it could mean that we all know that it happened, we all acknowledge it happened, but just don't talk about it. For example, I'm part in this group right now, none of us talk about it, but we know that I farted, like we all know that I farted, but you just don't talk about it, doesn't mean you are denying the fact that I farted in this room. The second is that reparations you can give reparations on other metrics, like things like social, economic status, or things like giving social welfare to individuals. We can give welfare to individuals who are disenfranchised just without labeling it as you are oppressed by the dictator. None of the opposition bench activates unless they can assure us that the conversations happen in a productive manner. But this will never happen because the complex nature of post-conflict nations is that there are competing narratives and competing versions of the truth. Over here in our ivory towers, we can say that the Khmer Rouge did the killing fields, but when you're in the moment and you're on the ground as the living in that situation, it's never that clear whether this dictator's legacy is entirely good or entirely bad. These are painful conversations that advantage bigger groups with more political power. They have the ability to control facts and control history. All of the history textbooks, all of the TRCs and what facts are allowed to be in the TRCs are ultimately controlled by these bigger groups, which often happens along ethnic lines. Peace and stability is the most important outcome. Justice ends up obfuscating the wrong house.
Thank you very much for that speech. To conclude the top half, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
If you're feeling a little bit confused, our case seems a little bit offset, but not perfectly intersecting with open governance, I think there's two broad reasons why that's the case. The first is, a lot of their examples and a lot of their analysis in the debates describes a number of states that have occurred post-military coups against those types of dictators. Unfortunately, this does not make a great deal of sense in the debate, because the info site explicitly describes the process of major parties forming some balanced form for getting the truth. If it is merely a military coup that then replaces that dictator, that process never actually eventuates. We're talking about civil and ideological conflict. We're talking about countries like Lebanon or Yugoslavia. In the process of overcoming and fighting against those authoritarian regimes, there were clear ideological or ethnic parties that then formed the divisions of their states, not military dictatorships. But the second big thing here that I just wanted to point out is the process of how that occurred and what ultimately led to the overthrow of that dictatorship. Because the core part of our case is that in the process of overthrowing dictatorships, yes, rebel groups often did do some wrong. Very frequently, they still kill civilians, either out of collateral damage or either targeting those individuals that they see are collaborators that are, for instance, providing administrative services to those type of coups, to those types of dictatorships. For instance, in South Korea, there was a large anti-war and communist ideological movement that committed a number of war crimes in the pursuit of overthrowing the dictatorship in South Korea. And yes, we recognize and we understand in this debate that the right-wing Conservative Party in South Korea was more sympathetic to that dictatorship, and it was justified in hating many of the communists in that state. I don't think we ever contested that coming out of opening government. And so the core question of the debate then is, firstly, and perhaps most importantly, what is the actual likely alternative that these parties seek? Because the crux of this opening government case is, your party has strong incentives, if not to forget the past, to just try and tell their truth, to just try and suppress the forms of things, for instance, dictators committed war crimes, and to perpetuate that truth. We overwhelmingly explained why this was very unlikely to be the alternative in the debate, for the simple reason of the actually somewhat that they describe. that there is some degree of balance of power where there is no clear victor between these parties post these states. That is why they are able to form these compromises to forget the past, and it is why there is not a clear, powerful actor that can then perpetuate their will and tell only their truth. That is why we supported a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not forms of, for instance, punishing or providing forms of legal recourse, because we can't, right? We recognise in this debate that there are still forms of people that are subject to those forms of dictatorship within the government. That is why we can have some form of truth and reconciliation, but not some form of legal prosecution. Secondly, it is an explanation that they presumably still want to reconcile these countries. Like, even if they have slightly more power in this type of negotiating position, it just bewilders me why you would want to impose your will in the way that they describe so vehemently. And the reason key to that, I think, is an explanation that yes, they may co-opt this truth-telling process and there might be some imperfections, but it will not be believed by genuine citizens if they do it in a particularly harmful way. And I'm going to provide two more reasons why it's likely to be independent. The first huge reason is for any Truth and Reconciliation Commission to actually determine some truthful historical finding to be broadly accepted by the populace. It tends to need significant international cooperation and oversight. That looks like trusted international bodies like the UN cooperating in Cambodia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission that this opening government themselves described in the overthrow of the regime in Cambodia. And as such, these international regulation bodies have strong incentives to ensure that they don't totally monopolize the truth in ways that are deeply harmful, because they have their own lawyers and their own form of international reputation to not do so. I think the second huge reason is because the type of individuals that they need to buy in to these truth processes, you need the testimony of people on the ground, people that have committed these war crimes. That is why Bella's explanation of "do provide amnesty to those people" is what allows the truth to be perpetuated. If it was just a whole bunch of the victors saying this is the truth, people don't believe it. They only believe it when the actual individuals themselves describe the acts that they have gone through. That is why our explanation of the successful Truth and Reconciliation Commission that occurs in countries like South Korea or like in South Africa is only the more likely alternative in this debate. So then, even if you believe literally none of this, before that, I'll take question.
Yeah, you suggest that in many instances there is not a clear winner and there's a legitimate case for either side. Doesn't that seem to undermine your claim that everyone will get on? Won't they compete more, hate each other more, fight each other more?
They will not like each other. That is why we need a process to tell the truth, right? The debate is what process helps that reconciliation. We argue that the truth and the truth alone provides the justice that people need in order to be able to reconcile themselves. And I think this is the big problem, even if you don't believe that the alternative is some form of clear and more bipartisan form of truth-telling commission, is that no truth at all is the injustice that perpetuates the instability that our opening government describes. And the problem is people still feel significant degrees of suffering. And so, even if you don't give them a perfect degree of truth, that is what still builds this degree of trust that this judiciary, that this form of court that has been established can at least implement or do some forms of things in society. When you do not have that, you don't have people genuinely feeling like this state is different and it has transitioned away from the dictatorship of the past. Believing none of this, what else does opening government tell us? They tell us, look, there is a huge amount of brainwashing of these type of populaces that make them sympathetic to these dictators. If we have this type of truth-telling, these sympathizers will be very, very, very angry. The problem with this is broadly twofold. Firstly, no celebration is, like, the case is, like, we shouldn't celebrate because otherwise we'll provoke them. The first thing is we are always going to have to provoke this group to a degree of extent if you ever want any form of positive change more broadly in society. That is, any good form of reconciliation will upset this group. So I think they need to be more specific as to why this form of provocation was unlikely to be meaningful, and we've explained why the truth is meaningful. But second, the response to people being brainwashed is not to be silent and allow them to be brainwashed. Because it allows them to organise rallies, to do things, for instance, non-sanctioned non-state sanctioned celebrations, which are really provocative. Like when they get out there on the streets venerating some dictator, that so causes and inflames the type of violence that they describe. When you do not have a clear way to respond to that brainwashing, to say this is the truth that we have decided as a state, to be able to justify or legitimize some degree of response to that, you allow it to fester, or if you do crack down on it, it appears unjustified and people no longer understand why you're cracking down on it on that way. And I think at the end of this, therefore, what we explain is forgetting the past does not allow people to genuinely deal with the trauma that they have. It does not allow political reconciliation, which is why say decades after this conflict has only been able to do this process, that process has been much worse.
Thank you very much for that speech, and now we move on to the closing cap, and I'd like to invite a member of government.
The opening half of this debate asks the question, what is best for post-conflict states? This is a fair question, but it's not the question for the round. The most important question is, how do we get these states to be post-conflict rather than active conflict? Because even the worst, most corrupt, poorly resourced, inefficient peacetime government is preferable to a dictator who remains in power for longer, who is able to actively extend that war, kill millions, maybe tens of millions, displace hundreds of millions. That's going to be the first extension to CG. A Pact of Forgetting makes it far easier to end wars and remove dictatorships, which is far and away the biggest impact in the debate. Let's start by talking about the incentives of dictators, because the premise of this debate is that these are post-conflict states. The inverse allows us to assume that this conflict is a conflict that removes them, rather than them peacefully stepping down before, and a post-conflict group has now taken power. The incentives of these dictators are pretty obvious. Firstly, they're interested in self-preservation. They want to be kept safe from the people that oppressed for years, rather than ending up like Colonel Gaddafi, who got bayoneted to death by those people in Libya. Secondly, they want to preserve their own power and that of their cronies. They want to ensure that they're able to still extract wealth. They want to make sure that their ability to shape that country is still preserved. And thirdly, they care about ensuring their legacy, which they are nationalist strongmen in the vast majority of cases. They do genuinely think they're doing what's best for their country in many cases. They do care about preserving their country the way they want it to. Under the opposition bench's world then, you have to ask, when the chips are down in this conflict, it now poses a genuine threat to their survival as a dictatorship. What options do they have on the table? In their world, they have two options. Either A, they can surrender or step down as a result of negotiations, and either go into exile, where they will never have access to that kind of power, where their legacy will be torn apart behind them, or to face prosecution, where they face the prospect of the death penalty or life in prison, or and all of their legacy that they've established is going to be removed. There will be brutal criticisms of them. Obviously, dictators do not want to do this when they are making that risk calculus. The second option then that they are likely to resort to is they continue fighting on. They ramp up the crackdowns and oppression. They do more conscription into the army to push back against the encroaching rebel groups. They try to maintain the military power they need in order to ensure their own power. They engage in more brutal tactics to demoralize rebels, things like bombings, things like counterinsurgency measures, things like engaging in torture of people. We think a Pact of Forgetting, when it is on the table, uniquely in negotiations, is able to get them to step down far quicker and far more cleanly in our world. Why is that the case? 3 reasons. Firstly, it creates an enormous normative shift when now post-conflict states, other post-conflict states, have offered this Pact of Forgetting previously. It is expected by future dictators that in the event that they step down, they know that it is an option that the new government is not going to try and prosecute them or their cronies. It's not going to try and undermine what they perceive as their legacy, which means they are much more interested in coming to the table in the first instance. They're less likely to reject those negotiations out of hand. Secondly, their risk and reward calculus changes both for the dictators, but also for their inner circle, who now know there is an avenue for them to avoid prosecution. So they're more likely to give counsel to that dictator and advise them. It might be time to consider negotiations. It might be time to consider stepping down when it is clearly becoming untenable, when it is clear that the rebels are gaining momentum far quicker than in the comparative, when they are more likely to hold on to the bitter end, when they are less likely to trust those negotiations, when there is more risk that if they engage those negotiations, they are going to end up dead or in prison. But thirdly, it can be often explicitly in negotiations. Because the way these negotiations work is they bring multiple parties in the conflict to the table to try and get them to work out what kind of a deal would enable us to get peace. That includes opposition political parties. That includes the people who would be then charged with enforcing this Pact of Forgetting, doing all the policies that opening government talk about. Which means you can explicitly offer the dictator and their regime the ability, the promise of a Pact of Forgetting. You will not be prosecuted. Your inner circle will not be prosecuted. Your legacy will not be torn down. We're just going to discuss it. You can fuck off with a huge amount of money to Switzerland or whatever. That is something that is likely to be far more enticing. And that is really, really important, because it means they're both more likely to negotiate and come to the negotiating table, which is in and of itself a benefit, because often that requires things like a temporary ceasefire or allowing aid to be provided as a condition of good faith, which has enormous benefits to millions of people on the ground in that conflict. But also, secondly, it just means that the
negotiations are significantly more likely to be successful, and be successful earlier when the Pact of Forgetting is on the table, when dictators know that that is an option, rather than being threatened with death or execution or life in prison, which is what opening opposition defend with all the material about accountability, which is why you are significantly more likely to get them. Because the alternative then is the war goes on longer as the dictator desperately clings to power, and then might just flee anyway, which means they don't get their accountability in all the cases. The impact of this is very, very simple. More people die in their world. More foreign proxies interfere in these wars as they run for longer, which means they're more likely to spill over and affect more people, cause refugee crises, maim people, torture people, displace people. More people just suffer immensely under side opposition. What is the weighing of this extension? Firstly, forget about the material in the top half about entrenching the legacy of the dictator or the truth, or undermining the lived experience of victims. This creates more victims, which is obviously more important in terms of weighing, because you create more people who have suffered. You create a bigger war that kills more people, you hurt a huge number more people. Secondly, we have far more certainty in the sense that we are now able to align the incentives of dictators with those people who want to end the war faster, as opposed to the back and forth about which side gets marginally more stability after that war has already ended. We just find that the urgent priority is ending the war, and a Pact of Forgetting being on the table is what enables that to happen. Thirdly, we have by far the longest impacts, because this is what is necessary to end the war quickly, and which is a precondition to any of the material about reconstruction and trust in a new government. So, OG maybe gets some speculative benefits about stability after the war, maybe. OMO maybe gets that some people will feel angry. That is not anywhere near as important as ending a countrywide war. Even individual spats of violence when people don't trust this new government simply cannot compare to that. Opening.
Yeah. Why did Germans trust the dubious promise of we'll try to forget your crimes over trusting the offer for amnesty in the exchange for testimony?
Because obviously now you bring all parties to the table and offer this. Also, note this is not mutually exclusive. This is just another signal, in fact, it's very powerful at convincing dictators to be prepared to step down. Also, this is now like this is now be made as part of like a binding peace agreement. Like this is not something that is like unlikely to that is like this is a mutually exclusive benefit. Alright, let's talk about secondly about briefly. I'm just going to rebut a little bit by pointing out problems with the opposition bench. Explain that accountability is really unlikely to be done well, which is a precondition for you to believe any of the benefits of accountability. The first thing I would note is that the incentives of both governments and the general population after conflict are incredibly likely to prioritize moving on, rebuilding infrastructure, getting people back to work, making sure that the country is getting things like foreign aid, because obviously that is a far more proximate and relevant concern to the vast majority of people, because the vast majority of people under dictatorship didn't personally lose a family member. They probably don't have as intense feelings of resentment as they do prioritizing other things like getting their economy back through rebuilding infrastructure. Secondly, these governments face extraordinary resource constraints. They have damaged infrastructure, they have lots of dead people, there's been lots of capital flight and destruction. Thirdly, often the people in positions to do things like war crimes trials were part of that old regime, so unless OMO wants to fucking purge the bureaucracy and prosecute them, I don't know how they're going to be able to run all of this logistically. And OMO's own characterization bites when they asked it, because we don't know who's in power, we don't know what this government wants, which means there is a huge amount of uncertainty on the entire opposition bench. CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome member of opposition.
I'll begin by flipping closing government. What they say is basically that you need to stay on the table to get the dictatorship to resign. I would suggest that actually what you need on the table is the promise that you'll get very, very harsh response unless you resign, and that's crucial. What happens on outside the house? You tell the dictator that they have to fuck off, and crucially, you potentially engage in negotiations with members of the regime. But what you do is you individualistically offer them things like amnesty deals in exchange for ratting out everyone else on the regime, for example, and so you're able to gain access to information. And crucially, you do it separately from each other, such that they don't know who's giving what information, such that they all reveal it, or they all tell on the top guy, because they're not sure if he's continuously giving them any more benefits. Because the previous justification for being part of the elite was that the dictator would promise you loads of wealth. That's going away now when it looks like you're going to lose this war, and so you're far more willing to flip. Offering them the option of opting out and not facing any harm is far worse than an asset house which gets them all to turn on each other and flips them and ends the conflict that way. Our case is going to be very simple. This debate takes place in post-conflict states. Necessarily, those conflict states have super entrenched, very powerful rebel groups and potential international forces there. They are going to be super pissed by this and are probably going to cause conflict again. So, I want to be very clear about what the context of this debate is. It's not necessarily fully countries like the Philippines, where Marcos was ultimately replaced in a peaceful election, but it's more countries like Ireland, Balkans, and so on, which has two implications. First of all, the dictatorship is probably incredibly weak, for the reason that conflict has lost the dictatorship support because of things like the body bag effect, things like the economic harms on the elite places, things like, particularly the mass rebellion that's happened there. But also, crucially, the opposition groups are probably incredibly strong in these contexts, for the reason that oftentimes they are fighting against a dictatorship that was incredibly entrenched, for the reason that conflict is a last resort after peaceful means have failed. Which means, to overthrow such an entrenched dictatorship, or to be in a position where you can force them to accept this deal, the opposition probably has 1, hardened, entrenched, militaristic rebels, 2, a large, diverse group of backers. So it's probably not one centralized opposition, because it's very easy to just kill the leader. It's probably a bunch of different individualistic warlords, or different individual powerful commanders and so on, and so forth. Third of all, it probably have international backers, because oftentimes it's very hard to replace an entrenched regime. So you often have the US backing you. Miloš, you know this, you know what the US is in the Balkans. So, yeah, they probably have international backers, but fourth of all, they're probably prominent victims of the regime who are really disliked and who are like symbolic cases to oppose it. So, for example, the brothers of the Plaza de Mayor in Argentina, who had incredible levels of symbolic power as victims and so on. Our case is just that you're going to alienate all of these groups as a result of doing this policy. They matter more than potential supporters of the dictatorship regime. First of all, why do you alienate rebel groups? Bella says, and this is the extent of her analysis, they view the state as complicit. Here's the real analysis. I think a rebel group who has essentially, probably already, heavily demonized the regime, because that's the only way they could have successfully maintained the long-term level of conflict they've engaged in. It's probably individuals, on an individual level, put their lives on the line in order to replace the regime, and so literally risked it all in order to replace these guys. It's probably, as I said before, a diverse group of decentralized people. And now, by opening government's own analysis, a state that at the very least has members within it who are part of that regime, because that's the second argument in PM, is now telling you, oh, let's just not talk about any of the sacrifices you made, oh, let's just not talk about any harms the regime has done, your risk is essentially for nothing. They are obviously not going to accept that, right? Because it's literally the same people who have done this. Now, they might say, but if the rebel groups have agreed to this, or the leader of the rebel group has agreed to this, it's probably fine. But no, often that misses the structure of these rebel groups. Oftentimes they have a leader who is more moderate, who is a more palatable face to the international backers in the West, for example, and yes, they might sign on to the deal. But the radical individual foot soldiers who have fought in the regime and their divisional commanders don't necessarily have that acceptance. And so they're not going to accept this happening, and they're going to rile each other up. Because the central person necessarily doesn't have that much command over the rebel group, because they needed not to, because if they were killed, then the consequences of that would have been really bad. So they're probably extremely decentralized, and individual units are going to be extremely alienated by this. These individual units have often been armed by international backers in order to get rid of their regime, so they have the capacity to act. They're often military and hardened because these conflicts have lasted for a really long time. They have the experience, they know the terrain, and they're going to be extremely alienated because they think the entire reason that forced them to go into the conflict has now gone. They, I think, are most likely on their side of the house to restart conflict, to reinflame tensions, to try and overthrow the regime that they view as ultimately still being part of that awful dictatorship they risk it all for. And I think, given that end, that's going to lead to incredible amounts of instability. Second of all, on the victims. I think, again, they have symbolic power. They're probably alienated to the same region. They're probably going to engage in protest. And if the state engages in mass reprisals against them, that is going to be the galvanizing moment, the match that starts the fire of slipping back into conflict once again. And so that's going to be really bad as well. Lastly, on the international community, I think countries like the United States, for example, want a concrete benefit to their international adventures for the reason that the body bag effect, for the reason that the effects and costs of that are unclear. So they need accountability. They need to know for themselves that the regime was awful and the country has moved on from that and the regime has been systematically replaced. They can only gain that on outside the house. Yes?
Even if the narrative exists on their side, although we do not shift the focus away from practical nation building.
My friend, you accept that the narrative you push on us, the narrative is going to be super anti-regime. Our case is it has to be super anti-regime as the only possible way to gain post-conflict reconstruction, because obviously they're not going to carry out the long run. If they didn't, they literally risked it all just for the same fuckers to remain in charge anyway. Now, why would all of these groups accept this narrative on our side of the house, the super anti-regime narrative? I think by definition, and by what opening government try and push on us, they're going to obviously accept this because it looks like we moved on from the regime. They're going to accept individual prosecutions, and oftentimes they often demonize specifically the individual dictator who's at the top and view themselves as engaging in a personal conflict with them, and so their prosecution of that person and that person going in jail is probably sufficient to placate them. But also, I think, so I think obviously they're going to accept this. Also, if you buy opening government's analysis, which is that you continually demonize the old regime, we think that's great because you retain these groups on your side. What is the way of this material? Because to their credit, I think opening government have very good long-term analysis about how this might hurt the long-term functioning of politics as you get a pro-dictatorship and anti-dictatorship regime. Perhaps, but we would accept imperfect democracies over slipping back into hard-won peace. And I think that insofar as our case is a prerequisite to any kind of development happening in the long term, we win that debate overall. Let's be very, very clear. This is post-conflict states. Rebel groups are probably more powerful than dictatorship. This is going to be uniquely irritate them and cause them to cause more conflict. Very proud of this.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now, ultimately, I'd like to invite the government group to conclude the government side. Here, here.
I'll start by defending our extinction and explain why it means around. Both from closing opposition and opening opposition, we hear the claim that you can do things like offer amnesty deals, which means that our extinction is marginal. The first thing I would point out is that even if you believe all of that analysis, it is clearly still the most high impact material in this debate. It explains why there will be millions of people who will still not die as a result, because we provide an additional strong, at least comparatively much stronger, as Sam explained, signaling mechanism to ensure that people are far more willing to come to things like temporary ceasefires, to come to peace negotiations. The dictators do not cling on to their power. However, 4 additional reasons to believe that things like amnesty deals are not prevalent in the majority of circumstances means this is not only the most high impact material in the debate, but it is also the comparatively largest difference in the debate. First of all, obviously, as closing opposition strangely point out, there are often huge incentives to over-prosecute people for things like publicated demands that these people be beheaded, be jailed forever, have all of their assets ruined, which explains in many instances why dictators, as Sam points out, are never likely to accept amnesty deals because they do not have faith in them. And we, secondly, explain that this is why we need to consistently support it in these instances, because this creates the confidence that people believe in that it is actually done. When sit down. When rebel groups themselves believe that this is the best way to end conflicts, when they consistently engage in this procedure, then that is the only reason at which, first of all, rebel groups are likely to not follow through in the ways they describe, which are antithetical to dictators stepping down. And second of all, dictators are likely to believe that it will occur that way. The additional response from CEO is to say, like, oh, well, you can do things like play people off against the inner circle. But I would point out that this is just a far less effective mechanism that in many instances is obviously found out, because people have, vast communication networks, because obviously some people in that network that closes another, they still talk, they might all talk about running up the top guy, and then the discovery that everyone's been offered a deal comes out and they realise they shouldn't opt in that process. It means they stay in for far longer, it means they engage in more persecution in more violent ways. And the final thing I would point out is that this team says that, well, dictatorships are likely to be weak in the instances where we're talking about, and that means that there are a whole bunch of radicals that go on, and moderate leaders can't convince them not to continue the conflict and not to be overly prosecutorial. We explain why actually now the moderate people who are the head of that organization actually have an incredibly effective kind of alternative to being overly prosecutorial, because we establish this is likely to work in the majority of instances. We give them the credibility and the faith to opt into this process, which shortens conflicts. Let's talk more explicitly about closing opposition. Their extension is just that rebels will not like this because the majority of them are radicals and therefore things will get worse. The first thing I would point out is that our extension already explains in many instances why you mitigate a whole bunch of those harms, because you explain why the majority of rebel groups are likely to pay off of this and these dictatorships are likely to accept it, which just means that conflicts occur for less time, which means that people are less radicalized in the first instance, and it means that the amount of harms in general that occur in this debate are lessened. The second thing I would point out is to explain that not as many people are radical in these groups that you would have to believe for their harms to apply, and that's because in many instances, people have just been conscripted out of necessity. They did not want to fight, they had to fight, sit down, in order to ensure that they didn't die. They are tired from fighting, they've seen their brothers die, they can't go home to their families. It is just so unclear why there are enough radicals just about a huge governmental uprising that would be comparative to the harm that CG explains to avoid. So, even if some radicals are upset, it is incredibly unlikely why there are enough of them to start a full-scale war. But finally, obviously, our extension provides an implicit flip to suggest why these people are placated comparatively, and therefore you get less of the instances that CO describes. Let's now talk about opening opposition. Okay. Opening opposition's claim goes as follows. It's very unclear who the winner is, so everyone believing that the truth will occur is good because people will opt in for stability. The first thing I point out in a point of information is that obviously the people who are unclear of who the winner is means that in many instances the information will be heavily politicized because there are strong electoral incentives as a huge voter base that you represent ideologically, you believe this, to cover up information, to make the process more difficult, to make it longer, to mean that the exact types of extremism that they describe occur more in their world. The response that we get is that, well, the attempt to engage in truth-telling provides people the confidence to opt in. But obviously this is not the most dominant incentive for people in post-conflict states. Like, symbolism is not as strong of an incentive as the huge amount of conflict that has occurred. The fact that it's difficult to collect data and there are often contested facts, there are often contesting testimonies, which explains why in many instances people will be disillusioned and they won't be able to reach consensus. And that provides a number of problems for this opening opposition team. First of all, no, it establishes that you are likely to, in many instances, create more victims. Not only for the reason that closing government provides to suggest that conflicts are worse and they go on for longer, but for the additional reason that you empower many of the voices that opening government describe. The other thing I would point out is that things like providing financial support now become a harm because they are seen as a particularly politicized policy. It is seen as the government taking a stance on who was right and who was wrong. That is the exact reason why this is likely to backfire in the ways that they describe. Before I go on, I'll take a point of information from closing opposition.
It does not matter whether the dictator or rebel sympathizer groups are bigger, the smaller group can still start a fresh conflict. Are we the only team to try and achieve genuine reconciliation over time through truth-telling?
Strange to appear why you're closing this extension, firstly. Second of all, no, I'm just not going to concede to the assertion that you've beaten us. I believe that we have proven why conflicts are shorter. I believe we have proven why far less people die. I believe we have proven why it is less intergenerational and people are able to come to a resolution. Let's weigh closing government against opening government. Opening government essentially claim that politics and state reconstruction is easier now, and to their credit they prove this fairly well, but the way to describe this is to explain that people still like the dictatorship and therefore there will be conflict, which the frequency of this occurring is never really structurally proven. It's very unclear why in the majority of instances, for example, they give characterization to believe this is the reason for why you reduce conflict. We provide a series of much better reasons. First of all, we explain that economically, shorter conflicts mean that less infrastructure is developed. Your labour force is bigger, which often means you get more investment. It means that people are less divided as a result of, so there's less intergenerational conflict, which means people are more willing to work in the middle. We explain that in addition to allowing states to improve better, we don't wreck them as much in the first place, which not only allows them to achieve that benefit quicker, but promotes an active harm. It means that millions of people don't die in many instances. And for that reason, opposing government has to win the round. Because we essentially explain that every team is trying to fix a problem, and whether or not you think one team fixes that problem better than another, we just describe why the problem happens less often, therefore we win.
Thank you very much for that speech. And the last speech of today, I'd like to invite the opposition whip. Here.
are two threats to any new government in these post-conflict states. One of them is the old government. That's what three teams in this round talk about. But I'll start by talking about the far more important one, which is the people who toppled the old government. And we thought this was pretty important because they're the ones who are stronger, they're the ones who won the fucking war. The opening opposition tries to frame us out by talking about how supporters of the dictatorship can restart the war. First of all, these people are often the least ideological ones. They're the people who joined the dictatorship because they were in power, they could get a bunch of money, cheers, whereas the people who fought against it are often the ones who had their families disappeared by the regime. Second of all, but these dictatorship people are weaker. You can just kick them out pretty quickly, they've already lost the war, whereas the rebel groups who have all the guns and the international backing are the ones that can actually start shit. Third of all, often these people, I guess this is conclude with the first thing, often these groups just don't fucking exist anymore. Think about the Nazis after the fall of Berlin. Think about the Hutu power faction after Kagame fucking gave him the boot in Rwanda. And so, this is clearly the most important group in the debate, and we would note a few things about them. They're often diverse and are highly unorganized. For instance, if Myanmar opposition is to tackle the government, there's a group of 6 different ethnic militias that have never got on in the past. It's very hard to please them. They have a variety of interests, but they are only united by their opposition to the dictatorship. So when closing government says they're probably not radical because they're conscripted and I guess a bit sleepy because they've been fighting too long, I think they're probably fired up and a bunch of their compatriots have died, if they have been put through hell and back. And so we would know, on government bench, what you do is you piss off all of them, because usually there's some party that's got a little bit more power than the others. And now what this is perceived as is then saying, first of all, your comrades died in vain, for nothing. Their deaths will be papered over, and we are going to pretend that nothing happened. Second of all, you just don't give them what they want. They wanted to bring people to justice, because these people are often very ideologically motivated, and so when they don't get what they want, they're going to try and get something, be that plunder, be that loot, be that territory or rape, or all sorts of other things that fighters do when they don't get what they want. But third of all, they fear further encroachment. They've already had something taken away from them. They fear more, they are motivated by fear, and so they're going to fight. And so you go back to war, and this is the biggest harm in the debate, because that's what everyone else has said is the biggest harm in the debate. So when closing government tries to rebut us by saying, well, they outweigh it, they're like, well, we get fewer conflicts. One, no you don't, because your extension is wrong. But second of all, it's outweighed, because if there's fewer, they go far longer, and on their side, they don't have a plausible way to actually end conflict. So insofar as that happens, that one alone is the one to win the debate. But I think we also win on a far more trivial debate that everyone else has, evaluating the weaker threat, which is the whole government. First of all, we show that they get torn apart by infighting when we have these sorts of TRCs, when you get individual ones to dog on the others, where no one in the old regime, even if it is heavily dug in, can trust anyone else, and doesn't want to do anything that can lead to other people getting information that they can then use to inform on them and get an amnesty and get a nice life. Closing government says, well, this won't be effective because the informants will get found out. Yeah, that's the point. Now you can't trust people, right? Because you don't know who's going to inform. The second mechanism we have is get a lot more information, which means that people who previously supported the dictatorship don't support it anymore. And you know this is important because if you look at the extent to which the length to which dictators go to hide atrocities that they commit, they don't want their supporters to find out that they're the bad guys. They don't want their supporters to think that they're part of an evil regime. And so once you bring this out, sure, maybe the hardliners, maybe the people who are complicit up to the neck in the worst atrocities don't believe, but the vast majority of the rank and file are likely to, once you get information which we get on our side and they don't get on theirs. But third of all, you just get new information, you learn more about the structure of the organisation, and so you're far better able to take it on. Because that's the issue with opposition bench. You leave an incredibly powerful organisation in power, and you are completely in the dark as to its structure, its powers, its wants, and what its current machinations are. Only on our side, when you get more informed, you're able to do that. So that's how we beat opening opposition. We offer a path to root out the problem, and we identify the problem as the lack of knowledge. They also try and get ahead of us with the POIs and get genuine reconciliation, etc. But we don't really need genuine reconciliation if you've already dismantled the backpack. Direct rebuttal time. Closing government. They have one big extension, which is about how you get dictators to step down. Australia moment. 7 responses. First of all, they're often just far too ideological to step down. They've devoted their whole lives to one particular project. They're just never going to walk away from it because they're so stubborn. Second of all, their soldiers won't let them sit down. This is the rank and file. They only talk about the inner circle. But we're talking about their bodyguards, their elite soldiers who have often seen their friends die, who have put their lives at risk and they don't want to be sold out. They don't want to lose the power they have, and so these people in power are going to be afraid of their soldiers turning on them. Third of all, they just don't trust the opposition to keep to the terms of the deal. These are people who are just trying to kill them. Fourth, we can offer amnesties too. Sure, maybe this is only marginal, but at marginal coin. Leave the ball, it's counteracted by there now being an incentive to become a dictator. The image of Gaddafi getting sodomized by a bayonet has probably made one or two generals think twice about their plans to launch a coup. And so on that side, you get rid of the worst case. You don't die in a ditch. You don't have all these worst things. And so why not fucking execute a coup or try to become a dictator? Sixth of all, even if on government bench, you're able to get rid of the dictator, our extension shows where conflict actually continues, and so even if you get rid of the dictator, that's not the end of the conflict, therefore their thing isn't sufficient to win. Seventh of all, because on the outside you have far better information about the structure of dictatorships generally, because of all the states you've done this in, you have better information about how dictatorships in general are structured, and so you're better able to identify the negotiation strategies that are likely to be able to successfully de-escalate conflict. Because we can still negotiate, just on their side you're flying blind. I'll take over.
You're missing the other half of the equation. Maybe you please rebel groups on your side, but you antagonize dictator loyalists, or net you stir conflict and instability.
Well, no, you don't really antagonize dictator loyalists because we show, like, they find out their old regime was really bad. Insofar as there are a few dictator loyalists, you're best able to contain them with the knowledge that you have. Our extension defeats that. But also the loyalists are in most cases, like if we talk about a single example, it isn't the Philippines, it isn't even as much, I think our extension gets ahead. Direct responses to opening government. They have two main claims. The first is that this is divisive. First of all, they don't fix this. Because by their response in the DPM throughout POI, people already know about all of the crimes that have been committed. I think not in PM. Already know about these particular crimes. And so even on our side, they're like only on their side, they're only implicitly talking about the dictator. They're still talking about the dictatorship. You still have this division. Look at Spain, we all know how to fight for worlds. Second of all, our extension makes this. Because what we do is we weaken the support of the old regime, so even if there's division, one side is just way smaller than before. The second thing they say is that new governments can get away with bad things because you set a low bar. First of all, there already is a low bar. Second of all, people care about absolute standards. That means they can put food on the table if the economy's going well, rather than relative standards. Never got that. Third of all, we just have better governments on our side because people are aware of the crimes that happen. Ultimately, our extension deals with the biggest threat, but we also deal better with than any other extension with the second biggest threat, closing opposition for the